Frog Fractions is a game about fractions. You play as a frog who's trying to defend his fruit from an army of invading bugs, taking the form of a Space Invaders style old school shmup. It's a classic setup, particularly for flash games, but the really interesting part of Frog Fractions, and what I want to talk about today, is the fantastic way that it makes maths fun and teaches you everything there is to know about fractions using cutting edge, early 80s game mechanics. But first, a bit of a spoiler warning. I am going to be spoiling all of the sums in Frog Fractions. Yes, even the optional top-heavy polynomials. So if you haven't played it, please stop the video, go and play Frog Fractions, and then come back. There is a link in the description because we're about to get into some pretty tricky maths. Okay? Right, see you in a bit. Are they gone? Okay, let's start the real video. As you ought to have figured out by now, Frog Fractions is not, in fact, a game about fractions, but a beloved, genre-bending masterpiece that turns from a shoot-'em-up into a visual novel, into a walking sim, then a text adventure, and so on. The game is nuts in the best possible way and has earned a bunch of awards and acclaim for good reason. But why am I talking about this 8-year-old game now? Well, Frog Fractions is... The Game of the Decade edition for the game I just mentioned, plus its brand new Hat DLC, came out just a few weeks ago, and I thought it would be a great idea to look back at Frog Fractions and consider what made it so great in the first place. Because, if I'm being completely honest, it sure as hell wasn't the gameplay. Frog Fractions is trivially easy, it controls awfully and has entire systems like the bug erotica creation mechanic that are more or less entirely pointless, and don't even get me started on the DDR bit. But the thing to note is that while Frog Fractions is weird, clunky and at times just plain badly designed, that's kind of all part of the charm. All those things I just mentioned are either deliberate jokes at the player's expense or subversions of our expectations, done so as to highlight the fundamental weirdness of video games that we often forget, or to make a commentary on the way we play them. So what, right? Frog Fractions is a joke game, why are we still talking about it? Well, that's because Frog Fractions is actually a part of a much larger cultural trend, that being metafiction, a word that draws from the ancient Greek word meta, meaning beyond or to transcend, and the English word fiction, meaning, you know, stories. Metafiction, and by extension meta games like Frog Fractions, are games that transcend the usual limits of video games by directly interacting with the player or commenting on the nature of games themselves. You might have heard the term metagame used to refer to the balance of strategies and options in a competitive sense, and whilst a competitive metagame is all about decisions that take place outside the normal scope of the mechanics, it's also not quite what I'm on about here. It's a bit confusing. I just wanted to outline the distinction. Not only is metafiction an incredibly powerful tool to create extremes of emotion in the minds of Jacob from New York and Emily from London, it's also a crucial milestone in the development of video games as a medium, as they mature into something more than simple entertainment. But how can that be the case? I hear you ask in the internet comments. How can making dumb jokes about princesses in castles and gamers always doing what they're told push the medium forwards? Well, I'm glad you asked, because that's what I'm here to explain today. I'm going to give you a crash course on a few of the most popular ways metafiction can be used in games before explaining why it's so important to the medium at large. Sound good? Wait, why am I asking you this? I wrote this like a week before you'll ever get to see it. You don't actually have any say at all. Let's just move on, shall we? If you haven't heard of metafiction before, you probably have heard of breaking the fourth wall, which is sort of the same thing. Fourth wall breaking is something that comes from theatre. See, in a traditional stage play, there are 3 closed walls and 1 transparent one through which we observe the action. When the actors run into the stands or interact with the audience in any way, they're breaking the barrier of this imaginary fourth wall. So, when a piece of media acknowledges it's not real, by breaking the fourth wall of the stage, screen, or I guess paper, it can be a great source of comedy. One of my favourite examples of fourth wall breaking is in the movie Spaceballs, where in order to work out what's going to happen next, the bad guys watch a VHS copy of Spaceballs, the movie they're currently in. Video games can break the fourth wall too, and it's no wonder that so many metafictional games choose to take things in a comedic direction. By bursting through the fourth wall, metagames can make jokes that take us completely by surprise and also make fun of the responsibilities we as players are expected to have to ensure the game is played properly. In Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door, characters directly address the player, yell at them to pay attention, or in one memorable segment, ask the player to not rat them out to Mario. Similarly, in the Borderlands games, characters often make glib references to the fact that what's happening right now could only make sense within the context of a video game, and in Banjo Kazooie, characters will get angry at you for messing around during their lovingly prepared tutorial. Fourth wall breaks aren't the only kind of meta humor though. Games can also make jokes of themselves by using a metafictional perspective to question game design tropes and expose the inherent absurdity of the medium. This is exactly what Frog Fractions does. Realizing you have zero control over the VN segment invites you to mess around and say dumb stuff like you wish you could in every other visual novel. The cast of continually rotating friend characters who spout obvious information and won't shut up satirizes silly video game companions, and the walking simulator segment is funny because even though it's mocking quote-unquote introspective arty games and is composed entirely of lies, it manages to be one of the most engaging and entertaining parts of the game. But amphibian arithmetic isn't alone here. Poking fun and satirizing game design through metafiction is also done through quite a lot of other games, such as the recently released There Is No Game, a non-game which doesn't exist. The second level of There Is No Game is this big send-up of LucasArts style point and clicks which are infamous for their horribly convoluted puzzle design. In There Is No Game, however, your aim is to cheat your way around those very same puzzles by manipulating the CRT monitor the game is plugged into, going behind the scenes of the game, or destroying the UI. You see this hand that's clearly meant to be used for the pickup command? Well, now I'm gonna knock it out of place and then use it to smash stuff. Sorry game. There is something amazingly cathartic about seeing a classic moon logic puzzle and then bypassing it with an even weirder solution that somehow makes more sense in context. Like when a ritual calls for a bucket of snow, meaning you need to steal some ice cream from the game's internal directory of all the assets, and then use the cone to scoop up some TV static, or snow, by tuning it to the wrong frequency. Undertale would be a great example of both forms of metafictional comedy at once, exemplified by Sans and Papyrus the Skeletons, two classic video game baddies who defy this role in interesting ways. Sans is clearly aware of the player's existence and is constantly turning to the camera and breaking the fourth wall when he cracks jokes, or is messing with you by giving you classic tutorial advice in the least helpful way possible. Papyrus, on the other hand, satirizes video game villainy, presenting you with mazes, puzzles, and platforming gauntlets ripped straight out of other games, only for them to literally blow up in his face. The best example is when he spends ages reading out the incredibly complex rules for his impossible to solve randomized puzzle maze of doom, only for it to generate a trivial solution. Broadly speaking, meta-humor works because it deconstructs video games and allows us to look at the parts that make them up from a new perspective. In MMOs like World of Warcraft, we never question the lives of the quest givers standing around giving us chores because they're just a part of the game. But when you become one, in the quest Welcome to the Machine, you're given a glimpse into just how awful and stupid most players are, and have a good chuckle in the process. Making players laugh is only one half of an analogy I'll get around to finishing in the next draft. Metafiction can also be a fantastic avenue for freaking the player out. Just as metafictional and fourth wall breaking humour destabilizes our understanding of games and exposes the inherent weirdness, meta games can also terrify us by making us feel like we can't trust what we're seeing and removing the comfort that comes from knowing the game is going to react to our actions in a predictable way. To continue the Undertale theme, Toby Fox's Opus does this brilliantly as well. Spoilers for the first 30 minutes of the game, skip here to avoid them. When most players face off against Toriel, the first boss of the game, they want to try and beat her non-violently, but often can't find the solution. So they try to get her to low health and trigger the option to spare her that way, as they've been taught to do by Toriel herself on regular enemies. Unfortunately, as you gradually chip Toriel down to half health, your next hit will kill her instantly. It's a total moment of surprise that leads players to reload their save and try again out of nothing more than panic. However, even if they do successfully spare Toriel the second time around, Flowey the Flower, the main villain, is still there to call you out not only for your weakness, but also for cheating. The realization that Undertale remembers your attempts to reset it challenges several core assumptions about how games are supposed to work and freaks you out by removing the conceptual safety net that is you being able to reload a save and try again with no consequences. While we don't often realize it, the existence of a fourth wall between the fictional world and the real world can be an immense source of comfort, as it completely defines the terms of our relationship with video games. We get to exert control upon them by mashing buttons and pressing keys, but video games never get the same sort of access to us. So when this idea is challenged by games acknowledging the fourth wall, or even giving the illusion of having power over us for a change, it can be deeply unsettling. One of the most iconic examples of this is in the Batman Arkham games, where Scarecrow's fear toxin doesn't just mess with Batman, it messes with you as well. In Asylum, the fear toxin segments screw with your understanding of the map, taunt you with character deaths that never actually happen, and in one memorable scene, trick you into thinking the game has crashed, making you think you've lost all your save data. When the game stops glitching, it freaks you out even more by replaying the opening sequence only with Joker and Batman swapped. In Arkham Knight, it goes even further, replacing various character models and decorations with Joker-fied versions for a moment, lying about the controls, and even temporarily booting you into an entirely different genre. Pony Island, by the lovely Daniel Mullins, is more directly metafictional, and sees you playing a game within a game that may or may not be controlled by the devil. Pony Island will pull really creepy stunts like taking control of your keyboard and mouse, playing tricks on you by screwing the UI around, and even sending you fake Steam messages, amongst other stuff that happens later in the game, which I won't spoil. These kinds of scares are so effective because they break the unwritten rules of game design that we've learned after however many years of playing them. Mario, Zelda, Call of Duty, any of the foundational games that many people have played would never try to fuck with the player like this, so when a game does, it takes us off guard. By removing the sense of security we get from understanding the underlying rules of the game, we feel powerless and vulnerable. Even Frog Fractions does this towards the end of the game. After sleeping in the cryopod, you're thrust into a nightmarish version of the first level, but instead of playing as a frog, you're a pathetic, tiny-tongued human. Having an absurdly easy game be suddenly inverted into something that's totally impossible is weirdly unsettling, and it only works because of how trivial the regular game is. Meta-humor and meta-horror could be standalone video topics in their own right, and far better YouTube video essay people have done just that. But as I promised you, 1,646 words ago, I'm going to explain why metafiction is more important than simply making us laugh or trying to scare us. By delving into how games work at their most fundamental level, we can better understand not just what goes into making them, but how to improve our experience with them as well. And no game does this better than one of my all-time favourites, the Stanley Parable. In the Stanley Parable, you control a man named Stanley, who finds his usual office completely deserted and with an overly British narrator constantly talking in his ear. The narrator will guide you on a quote-unquote adventure where you deactivate a horrible mind control device by pushing a button, thereby earning your freedom forever. This is all a fairly simple meta joke on the surface. Stanley never really has any control, he's a thoughtless automaton controlled by the player. But when you think about it, neither do you, as you were just blindly following the narrator's instructions. This is where the Stanley Parable gets interesting. Instead of the game just ending, the Stanley Parable lets you play again, and this time, your mind has been opened to the possibility of defying the narrator.
He entered the door on his left. This was not the correct way to the meeting room, and Stanley knew it perfectly well.
Instead of blocking you with an invisible wall, or just funneling you back to the critical path, the game continues regardless of what choice you made, frustrating the narrator as well as unlocking a bunch of different endings. In one, the explosion ending, the narrator gets upset that you're trying to ruin his lovely story and kills you in a massive explosion. In another, where you defy all of his instructions, he comes to the conclusion that you aren't enjoying the game and makes a new one for you to play. And if you can glitch out the progression by backing out through a door you're not supposed to, you can even disable the narrator entirely and quote-unquote break the game. Of course, all this stuff is intentional, but the purpose is to highlight the inherent conflict between player and designer. Unlike in almost every other form of media, where whoever's telling the story has total control and can expect the audience to shut up and listen, in video games, the player has a certain capacity to change how the story unfolds. For example, in Event Zero, a game centering around the AI chatbot Kaizen, players manage to manipulate his AI into creating a brand new fourth ending the developers never intended. And in Breath of the Wild, players can abuse the physics system and push it way beyond its intended limits with the stasis ability as well as well-timed shield bounces to soar all the way to the final boss in a matter of minutes, completely bypassing 95% of the game. One thing that metafictive works like the Stanley Parable or Frog Fractions remind us of is that basically all media is meta to an extent. Even something as simple as an introduction, a credit sequence, or even a tutorial is breaking the fourth wall and addressing the world outside the story. And that's not even mentioning the fact that video games literally don't function without a player to drive the story forwards. Metafiction allows us to explore the way video games, designers, and players work in the same way we'd be able to explore ideas or emotions in other kinds of stories. Dr. Langeskov, The Tiger, and The Incredibly Cursed Emerald gives us a fascinating insight into the back end of game dev as you try to keep a complicated heist game running behind the scenes so the person actually playing has a nice time. And in Oneshot, an adventure/puzzle game, we're reminded by cute cat child Nico that whilst video games aren't real, our actions within their virtual worlds are a reflection of how we view reality. By unpacking the way games work, metafictional games can also criticize and challenge game design norms. Without Bioshock, we'd be much less conscious of the fact that games can subtly condition the player into thinking and acting a certain way. And Moon, a fantastic RPG for the PlayStation, points out that RPG protagonists do some pretty horrible things, and that violence shouldn't be the only form of conflict that games portray. Metafiction is one of those things that seems very high-minded and artsy with almost no practical application, and while that is absolutely true, it can also create some truly fantastic experiences as well as get us to appreciate media in a different light. This is why Frog Fractions is such a great introduction to the subject. The entire franchise serves as a way to remind us that the form of games isn't nearly as rigid and static as we like to think. The original game defies the limits of genre and expectation by constantly changing what type of game it is. Frog Fractions 2 was both an ARG that took place inside other indie games and was a minigame compilation hidden inside Glittermitten Grove, and Frog Fractions 3 was... you'll figure it out. Put your thinking cap on. Games can be so much more than what they are right now, and the first step to realizing that potential, as Frog Fractions teaches us, is to break down the format to see how it works, and more importantly, how it can be expanded upon and improved. Which is why after watching this video, you should be able to realize that everything I make is terrible, and that I should have been banned from the internet years ago. Getting rid of jokers like me is the natural path to improve the video essay format. Look, I don't make the rules, it's just gotta happen, okay? Hi, I'm not gone. That was what we in the business call a joke. Haha, I'm not going anywhere, fuckers. First of all, welcome to all the new subs who joined as a result of the longing video. That one did better than expected, didn't it? Whoa! And second of all, if you'd like to support my continuing nonsense, please give me some cash on Patreon. If you do, you'll get access to a very special thing, my university dissertation on metafiction in games, written like 4 or 5 years ago now? It's very bad and out of date, but if you'd like to see proto-architect of games in the flesh, then you can give that a read. And if you pledge $10 a month on Patreon, on the other hand, you get to join the illustrious and ever-growing list of my mysterious benefactors, who are Alex Deloche, Asaran, Alsakav, Baxter Heel, Big Chess, Bodhi, Branlab, Brian Notariani, Chill, Chloe Long, Konstantin Punkt, Daniel Metjes, David Sester, Dirk Jan Karambeld, Eugene Bulkin, Evie, Philip Magnus, George Sears, Gretar Hannison, Items to Astound on DM's Guild, Jacob Dylan Riddle, Jordan Gear, Joshua Binswanger, Janos Fakete, Kai Gillespie, Lee Berman, Lucas Slack, Lunar Eagle 1996, Mace Window 54, Max Filipov, NWDD, Patrick Romberg, Philby the Bilby, Regal Regex, Ray's Dad, Samuel Vanderplatz, Sheldon Hearn, Steve Riley, Strateger in Ultima, and Chow. Whew. Okay, that's it, that's all. See you in the next video. I promise it won't be a pretentious one this time around. Maybe. Bye!